My name is Jenna Hartley, and my family has spent most of my life treating me like the cautionary tale nobody wants to end up like. The funny part is, my sister was so sure I was a failure that she actually paid a private investigator to prove it. She told me about it like it was a joke, like I should be grateful she was finally checking up on me. There was this little smile on her face when she warned me that a big surprise was coming, as if my entire life was about to be dragged out and put on display. She thought the report would finally give her proof that I was exactly what she'd always said I was: the screw-up, the burden, the one who never added up to anything. What she didn't know was that I had stopped living my life for her approval years ago. I had my own plans, my own work, and more than one thing I'd kept carefully out of family conversations. I let her talk, let her feel like she was in control, while I quietly started preparing my own version of surprise. A week later, the report landed in her hands. I wasn't there when she opened it, but I heard about the look on her face. For the first time in my life, my sister didn't have anything clever to say about me. She just went quiet. And that silence was only the beginning of what would come next. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. Inside our house near the Jersey Shore, the roles in our family felt decided long before I was old enough to understand how unfair they were. My parents never sat us down and said who was the favorite and who was the disappointment. But the way they watched us, the way they spoke about us to other people, made the ranking very clear. My sister always occupied the top shelf. I was the one they mentioned with a tight smile and a quick attempt to change the subject. Growing up, everything turned into a quiet competition I never agreed to enter. Report cards were spread out on the kitchen table, but only my sister's grades were celebrated. Her trophies stayed lined up on the mantel, dusted and rearranged whenever guests came over. If I brought home something I was proud of, it usually ended up stuck under a magnet on the side of the fridge, half hidden behind grocery lists and appointment cards. No one had to say that her achievements mattered more. It just hung in the air like background noise. My parents loved telling people how driven she was, how she was always meant for something bigger than our coastal town. They described her life as proof that hard work and the right choices guaranteed success. When the conversation shifted to me, the tone changed in a way I could never ignore. I was the child who had a hard time sticking with things, the one who still needed to find her path. Those phrases sounded harmless on the surface, but they were repeated so often that they stuck to my skin like labels I could not peel off. At birthday parties, holidays, and backyard barbecues, relatives would drift toward my sister first. They asked about her job, her house, her children, their sports, their schools. When they finally turned to me, the questions were shorter and more practical. Was I doing okay? Did I have enough work to get by? Was I staying out of trouble? Nobody actually knew what I did day to day. They just acted like the safest assumption was that I was barely treading water. What made it worse was how normal all of this felt inside my family. My parents did not think they were being cruel. They saw themselves as honest, grounded people who simply called it like they saw it. In their minds, my sister's life proved them right about the world, and mine confirmed everything they feared about wasted potential. Every time they compared us, I felt myself getting pushed into a corner I never chose. I learned early that arguing with their version of reality only made things worse. When I tried to explain my choices, the conversation slid into lectures about responsibility and maturity. If I mentioned something I was proud of, the subject changed to a story about my sister's latest promotion or some sacrifice my parents had made when we were younger. Eventually, I stopped fighting to be understood. It was easier to let them believe what they wanted than to keep crashing into the same wall. Even the rhythm of our weekends reinforced the roles they had assigned. When my sister brought her family to visit, my parents lit up. The house filled with plans and noise and a kind of performative warmth that only showed up when other people were watching. When I came by alone, the atmosphere shrank. The energy dropped a few degrees. The questions turned sharper, more practical, as if they were conducting a quiet inspection instead of trying to catch up with their daughter. Over time, I started to notice how often my name came up only as a comparison point. I was the one used in warnings, the example pulled out when someone's teenager looked a little too uncertain about college or work. My life, or at least the version of it my family chose to see, became a story they told to reassure themselves that they were right about everything. I was not someone they were trying to understand. I was a lesson they were trying to teach. As the years went by, the gap between who I really was and who they believed I was only grew wider. I built a life outside their line of sight, but inside that house near the shore, I stayed frozen as the kid they had already decided I would always be. Years later, when I finally left my parents' house, I did it without a speech, without a big announcement. I found a small rental not too far from the shore and moved in with whatever I could load into the back of my car. There was no dramatic goodbye. My parents treated it like one more example of me drifting, another impulsive move I would probably regret, and I did not waste energy trying to convince them otherwise. My first jobs were not impressive on paper. I answered phones in a cramped office above a strip mall, sorted paperwork in a back room that always smelled like burnt coffee, and took whatever shifts nobody else wanted. What my family never saw was what those years actually did for me. I learned how companies worked from the inside out. I watched the way decisions were made, who really had power, and how much chaos hid behind polished logos and carefully worded emails. Little by little, I moved into roles that required more trust. I stopped working the front desk and started handling sensitive information, dealing with contracts, compliance reports, and things that had real consequences if someone made a mistake. I took trainings nobody else bothered to attend and said yes to projects that sounded dull from the outside but taught me how systems really operated. It was not glamorous, but it was steady, and it suited the way my mind worked. At some point, I realized I was making more money than anyone in my family assumed I was capable of earning. I paid off the last of my old debts, built an emergency fund that actually felt like a cushion, and started contributing to retirement accounts my parents had never once mentioned when they lectured me about responsibility. I did all of this quietly. I did not post about promotions, did not share snapshots of my office, did not send long messages to the family group chat describing what I was working on. On the outside, my life looked almost deliberately unremarkable. I kept driving an older car because it was paid off. I furnished my apartment slowly, choosing practical pieces instead of anything that screamed luxury. Most nights, I wore the same jeans and hoodies I had owned for years. When I visited my parents, there was nothing about my clothes or my bag or my keys that hinted at what my bank account looked like. To them, it was easier to believe that nothing had changed. The gap between their assumptions and my reality only widened every time we saw each other. They still asked the same questions they had been asking for years, as if I was stuck in the same place while everyone else moved forward. I learned to give short answers that did not invite follow-up. I said I was busy, that work kept me occupied, that I was fine. None of those statements were lies. They just did not come close to the full picture. Meanwhile, my sister built her own story about me and repeated it so often that it hardened into something like fact. In her version, I was the sibling who had never figured things out, the one always one step away from another mistake. She presented her life as the model of what adulthood should look like, and used mine as the warning of what happened if you did not listen. The more control she had over the way relatives talked about us, the less room there was for anyone to imagine that I might have grown into someone different. I heard pieces of that story in passing, A comment from an aunt, a stray remark at a barbecue, an awkward pause when someone realized I was standing close enough to catch what they were saying. None of it shocked me. It just confirmed what I had suspected for a long time. My sister did not want to understand my life. She wanted to be right about it. As she settled deeper into the role of the successful, responsible daughter, my choice to keep my life private started to irritate her. To a person who needs an audience, silence feels like an insult. The less she knew about my work and my finances, the more convinced she became that I was hiding something embarrassing rather than something I was simply protecting. In her mind, my story had already been written, and she was determined to be the one who got to tell it. That illusion finally cracked when my sister decided assumptions were no longer enough. She wanted confirmation, proof she could hold in her hands, something to point to whenever anyone wondered how I was doing. For someone who loved being seen as responsible and clear-eyed, the idea of having a formal report on my life must have felt irresistible. She dressed the whole thing up as concern. I found out later that she told my parents she was worried I might be hiding some kind of disaster, that it would be better to know the truth than be caught off guard. On the surface, it sounded generous, but underneath it was the same story she had always told about me. In her mind, I was not capable of building anything stable, so any silence from my side had to mean something was wrong. Hiring a private investigator let her turn that judgment into a project. Instead of admitting that she simply assumed the worst, she could point to a professional whose job was to sort through records and assemble a narrative. My life became a file she thought she could buy access to. Paying for that work made her feel justified in treating my privacy like a problem she was entitled to solve. I did not know about the investigation at first. What I noticed was a shift in the way my parents talked to me. They started asking oddly precise questions about my schedule, my address, and where I kept certain accounts. The words themselves were casual enough to pass in normal conversation, but the timing was too neat to ignore. It felt like invisible lines were being drawn around the edges of my routine, tightening with every visit and phone call. The confirmation arrived in the way that matched the reality of my work. A notice popped up from a monitoring service I use, flagging that a detailed inquiry tied to my identity had been run. It was just a quiet notification on a screen, but it snapped into focus immediately. I knew the kinds of checks agencies request and how rarely they are random. Somewhere, someone had decided that my background was worth paying to examine. From that moment, the situation stopped feeling like another family misunderstanding and started looking like a breach. Until then, their version of me had mostly shaped how I was treated at gatherings and in private conversations. Now it reached into my security and the boundaries I thought I had kept separate from them. I began tracking what they said more carefully, noting how often my sister steered conversations back to my life, and how quickly my parents accepted anything that made me look unstable. When the report finally reached her, it did not deliver the impact she had scripted. She had expected a tidy confirmation of everything she already believed, something she could summarize at the next holiday dinner with that satisfied, knowing tone everyone recognized. Instead, the file in her hands told a different story. It documented pay stubs, titles, balances, and a pattern of consistent decisions that did not match the character she had built for me. What she held was proof that I was not the liability she had always described. The report showed steady work, disciplined credit, and assets my family never imagined I could have accumulated. It did not make me exceptional. It simply showed competence where she had insisted there was chaos. For someone whose status in the family depended on being the only success story, that realization cut deeper than any argument I could have offered. My parents learned about the content soon after. The shift in their behavior came almost immediately. Conversations that used to circle around my supposed shortcomings turned into measured questions about my job, my plans, and how I had managed to end up where I was. There was a new note in their voices, something like respect, but it arrived late, and for the wrong reasons. They were not suddenly interested in who I was. They were suddenly interested in what I had. Seeing them look at me that way felt stranger than their old dismissiveness. For years, I had been the cautionary tale. Now I could almost see them recalculating, trying to fit this unexpected information into the story they had been telling about our family for decades. The numbers on that report did more than correct their assumptions about my life. They disturbed the image they had spent years polishing, and they were not ready to admit how much that unsettled them. And the days that followed, my attention shifted to the path my personal information had taken to end up in someone else's hands. The report I had seen was accurate, which meant the process behind it mattered even more. I had spent enough time around sensitive data to know that reports like that did not appear out of nowhere. I started with what I could control. I placed freezes on my credit profiles, tightened the security on my accounts, and documented every alert I had received. None of those steps changed what had already been exposed, but they drew a line around what could happen next. For the first time, my response to my family was not emotional. It was procedural. I treated the situation the same way I would if I were handling a case at work. From there, I began tracing the inquiry itself. The notification I had seen was vague, but it was not useless. It narrowed the type of check that had been run and pointed toward the kind of agency that would have requested it. I reached out to a contact who understood those systems better than I did and asked for guidance, keeping my explanation as detached as possible. I did not mention my sister by name. I described a hypothetical scenario and listened to the way my contact described the options. That conversation gave me enough direction to move forward. I filed formal requests for copies of any reports attached to my name and for the records of who had ordered them. I followed the procedures I had advised other people to use, but never thought I would need for myself. It took patience, but slowly, pieces of the trail came into view. An outside firm had compiled the report. A client had paid for it. The request had been framed as a background check tied loosely to concern about financial instability. The shape of it matched my sister's fears more closely than anything about my actual life. Even without seeing her name on those early documents, I could hear her reasoning in the language someone had used to justify the search. She wanted confirmation that I was irresponsible. The person who filled out the paperwork had repeated that assumption in more polite terms. By the time I saw the name of the firm that had handled the case, I knew I needed help from someone whose job was to protect people in situations like this. That was how I ended up in the office of an attorney named Erin Blake. Sitting across from her, I laid out the facts in order, leaving out the commentary my family had added over the years. I told her about the report, the alerts, and the documents I had received. I focused on actions, not emotions. Erin listened the way people do when they are used to sorting noise from signal. She asked direct questions about consent, access, and the way information had been obtained. She pointed out lines in the paperwork that suggested someone had overstated their relationship to me in order to justify the request. None of her observations surprised me, but hearing them described in clear, professional language turned my anger into something sharper and more focused. With her guidance, I documented everything in one place: notices, letters, copies of reports, and timestamps formed a timeline that no one in my family could dismiss as paranoia or exaggeration. She drafted a formal letter to the firm, demanding a complete accounting of who had ordered the investigation and on what grounds. She also outlined the steps I could take if it turned out that a relative had misused my personal information. Walking out of her office, I understood that whatever my sister had tried to do was no longer just a family issue. It was a matter of boundaries and rights, and there were consequences attached to it, whether anyone in my family wanted to acknowledge them or not. I had spent years absorbing their version of my story. Now, for the first time, I was building a record of my own. Back at home, I spread the documents out on my kitchen table and studied them like a case file. There was a quiet calm in seeing everything gathered in one place. I did not rush to call anyone. If this conversation happened, it would be in a room where everyone heard the same words at once. That room ended up being my parents' dining room on a late Sunday afternoon. They had insisted on hosting, as they always did when they wanted to feel in control. The table was set the way it had been for every holiday, even though there was nothing to celebrate. My sister arrived with her family and took her usual seat near the head of the table. My parents hovered around her with familiar, careful attention. I sat a little farther back, a plain folder tucked under my arm, waiting for the right moment to place it where everyone could see. The mood felt unsteady from the beginning. My parents tried to layer small talk over the strain, asking about traffic and schedules for the week ahead. My sister answered briefly. Her eyes moved around the room without resting on me for long. Everyone understood that something had shifted, but no one wanted to acknowledge it first. I let their questions trail off and replied only when I had to, giving them as little to work with as possible. I did not stand up or raise my voice. When the plates were on the table and there was no easy way for anyone to leave without drawing attention, I set the folder down next to my glass and opened it. I slid several pages out and placed them in front of me, the paper making a dry sound against the wood. The room quieted in a way casual conversation had not been able to manage. My parents noticed the documents before my sister did. Their attention shifted toward the table, their focus narrowing on the pages I had arranged. I explained, in plain terms, that I had received alerts about inquiries tied to my records, that I had followed up through the proper channels, and that I now had confirmation about how those inquiries had been made. I did not raise accusations. I described steps, sources, and the results I had been given. My sister's reaction came a few seconds later. She straightened in her chair and reached for her drink, as if the motion could buy her time to recover. She dismissed the details as unimportant and framed the investigation as a reasonable way to make sure I was steady. To my parents, that framing fit the role they had assigned her. They were used to trusting her version of events and used to believing that anything she did on my behalf came from a place of responsibility. I stayed with what was on the page. I pointed to the sections that described my relationship to the requester in terms I had never agreed to, sections that implied permission that did not exist. I outlined how the justification for the check leaned on assumptions about my instability rather than actual risk. The language was understated, but its meaning was clear. Someone had stretched the truth in order to gain access to information that was not theirs. As the details settled in, the surface of the evening began to break. My mother looked from me to my sister and back again, searching for a version of the story that would allow her to believe everyone had meant well. My father shifted into a tone I recognized from his working life, asking direct questions about who had contacted whom and why certain statements had been made. He wanted clean answers that did not rely on vague concern or old impressions. My sister tried to answer without conceding anything important. She leaned on the same narrative she had repeated for years, suggesting that my lack of openness justified whatever steps she had taken. The more she talked, the more obvious it became that the investigation had never been about helping me. It had been about controlling the story. With every attempt to defend herself, she revealed more of the entitlement behind her decision. Watching my parents absorb this was like watching a structure I had grown up inside begin to crack. Their faces moved through confusion, then embarrassment, then a guarded kind of anger. They were not only reacting to what my sister had done, they were confronting what it said about the way they had relied on her account of my life and how quickly they had accepted a version of me that fit their fears. For the first time, I did not feel the need to interrupt or to defend myself. The documents and the timeline did that on their own. I listened as my father pressed for specific explanations and as my mother questioned whether this had really been necessary. My sister circled the same points, insisting that she had only been trying to make sure I was all right, even as every piece of evidence on the table suggested otherwise. Eventually, the conversation lost any rhythm it had started with. Voices overlapped, then dropped, then rose again. There was no dramatic moment where anyone stood up and announced a realization. Instead, there was a slow, uneven recognition that the old roles in our family no longer fit what was in front of them. By the time the plates were cleared and the table was wiped down, the certainty that had once surrounded my sister's judgment did not look nearly as solid as it had when the day began. The weeks after that Sunday, my life shifted in ways that were subtle on the outside and permanent underneath. There was no announcement, no final showdown. The distance grew through ordinary choices. I stopped saying yes to visits that left me exhausted, let certain calls ring out, and answered messages with short, neutral replies that did not invite more. My parents tried to restore a familiar rhythm, only now there was an uncomfortable care layered over everything. They moved from lecturing me to offering help, but the offers carried an expectation that I would still protect the family image. They were less focused on what had been done to me and more worried about how our fractured dynamic might look to everyone else. They wanted peace without acknowledging the cost it had already taken from me. My sister took a different path. Instead of owning what she had set in motion, she tightened control over her side of the narrative. She trimmed me out of family conversations and presented herself as the one coping with a situation I had supposedly created. In the past, that version of events would have settled in as fact. This time, there was a file, a timeline, and a trail of decisions that did not match the story she was trying to tell. The consequences of her actions did not crash down in a single moment. They arrived gradually, in ways that fit how life actually unfolds. There were awkward questions from people who cared about consent more than appearances. There were professional conversations she could not dismiss when it became clear that boundaries around privacy and access had been stretched too far. There were explanations she was forced to give that sounded thinner each time she repeated them. Inside the family, the certainty surrounding her judgment eroded. Relatives who used to repeat her opinions without thinking began to hold back. My parents did not turn against her, but they could no longer pretend her choices always came from pure concern. Doubt took root where blind trust had been. That shift did not heal anything between us, yet it stopped the old pattern from running untouched into the future. For me, the most meaningful consequences were the ones I chose deliberately. With legal guidance, I formalized the boundaries I had once tried to hold with words alone. I updated documents to limit who could access my records or make decisions if I could not. I adjusted beneficiaries so that the people who minimized me for years would not automatically inherit control over what I had worked for. Those steps were not about punishing anyone. They were about aligning my protections with what I had finally accepted about how my family operated. On an emotional level, creating distance felt less like abandoning a home and more like stepping out of a story that had been written without my consent. The house near the shore was still there, but the role I had been assigned inside it no longer fit. Once I saw that role clearly, staying in it by choice would have been another way of agreeing with the version of me my sister had spent years presenting. There were days when the separation ached. Holidays passed with fewer invitations. News about milestones arrived late or not at all. Brief flashes of guilt surfaced whenever I imagined how things might look if I had stayed quiet and let everyone pretend nothing serious had happened. Those moments faded when I remembered that the breach had been a choice, not a mistake. Someone I shared a last name with had decided access to my life mattered more than my right to keep it my own. Looking back, what stays with me most is not the report itself, but what it revealed. It exposed how comfortable my sister and my parents had become with treating my privacy as flexible whenever it served their comfort. For years, I had tried to earn a different place in that structure, It took a stranger's paperwork to make me understand that some people would rather adjust facts than adjust how they see you. If there is anything I hope you carry from this, it is the understanding that you are allowed to walk away from roles that were handed to you instead of chosen. You are allowed to define where your information goes and who is trusted with it. A boundary is not a rejection of family. Sometimes it is the first step toward building something healthier than what you were given. My life did not turn into a perfect picture after I stepped back. It simply became something I could recognize as mine. I still live near the coast, still remember the years at that dining room table, but they no longer decide who I am. I decide whose voices matter, whose stories about me are allowed to stand, and what I am willing to tolerate in the name of keeping the peace. Thank you for listening to my story. If it made you think about your own boundaries or your own family, I hope you give yourself permission to draw the lines you need. And if this resonated with you, you can stay, come back for more, and share it with someone who might quietly be living through something similar.